The Fleming Museum has specific galleries for its permanent collection, and for quite a while we've had the European American galleries, which contains mostly 18th and 19th century pictures, some earlier pictures, and because we have no dedicated space for modern and contemporary, the thought was to interject some moments of that period into the permanent galleries to allow visitors to really see that actually we do have a collection of quite good modern and contemporary works, small but quite good. So the idea was that we would leave the front half of the gallery mostly intact to still retain that sense of historic progression. And then in the back half is where we'd really kind of mix things up and put in some more modern examples of the categories and to really kind of make people question what those categories are. My main goal was to really kind of stop people in their tracks and make people think, gosh, is this really a landscape or is this really a portrait? So, for example, that's why we have a Warhol cow in the landscape section. I really wanted to make people think, how is this a landscape? What does this say about the category? And make people question their own sort of sensibilities about those particular categories. I think a lot of people are going to be wondering how and why Warhol is in the landscape section. In fact, it could actually be in the portrait section. It's a portrait of a cow. It's a detail of a cow. But I think that the idea was to really make people question, what is this category? How is it a landscape? And thinking about Warhol and the pop sensibility of focusing on icons, Warhol does exactly that with this picture. He zooms in on the detail of a cow, and because it's against a blue background, one's association is that that cow is in a landscape. And so that was kind of the basis for thinking this might work in this category. When we were thinking about which pieces to add to the back half of the galleries, the sort of the more modern and contemporary pieces, the juxtapositions are key. So in many instances, for example, like the Warhol, we placed it next to a very traditional 19th century landscape with cows. But if you were to really look close in on that landscape, the 19th century landscape, essentially you could get another Warhol, because if you look really close at the cows, they're against blue backgrounds too, and Warhol just kind of brings you in tight and close, and there you have a landscape. With the Heidi, I think people who might not know his work initially just see a beautiful pastoral landscape of Mount Mansfield. But when you really start to look at it and spend time in front of it, you notice that there are tree stumps in the foreground. And one idea is that Heidi's making a comment on the deforestation of the land. There are other moments in that landscape that really allow visitors to see that Heidi was really acutely observing what was going on around him, not just the pastoral landscape that Vermonters know and love, but what was really happening ecologically and historically in that time period in Vermont. So in a way, even though it's beautiful and pastoral, it's very modern for its time period. The painting by Christopher Finnell is in the landscape section because once again, it's a very modern, contemporary example of a landscape, but a very abstracted landscape. Chris Finnell was a UVM graduate, studied here under Frank Hewitt, and he's gone on to great notoriety in New York. The painting at first glance looks like graffiti. In fact, I think that's part of his motivation behind it. But in fact, it is a garden, and in a way, if you think about Impressionist pictures, when you get really close to them, they dissolve and you can't see any of the flowers or any of the marks of the Impressionist. And that's, I think, in a way what Christopher Finnell is kind of channeling and tapping into, and yet he's using a very contemporary medium in which to achieve that through spray paint and other forms of graffiti. The juxtaposition of the Ed Ruscha print next to the Henry Pember Smith seascape, they're done about 100 years apart, and once again it was a very considered juxtaposition. We were trying to sort of show a traditional seascape in the Henry Pember Smith, and once again another sort of pop sensibility like the Warhol, where Ruscha is zooming in on the subject and kind of presenting an icon of the ship. If one were to sort of zoom in on the Henry Pember Smith, you'd see a very similar type of schooner, but Smith gives us more of the details in the surrounding sensibilities of the seascape, whereas Richet just makes it a pop icon right in front of us. The other paintings in the landscape section, many of which are done by Vermont artists, are there to suggest that these artists hold their own amongst European and American artists. I think it's important for Vermonters and New Englanders to realize that there is a long and rich tradition of painters within the region, and I feel that we need to give them their due and show them alongside these other modern masters. Genre, in many ways, is sort of a catch-all category as it represents scenes of everyday life, and so we were really trying to expand the categories, as traditionally they are generally tavern scenes, indoor scenes, and so by including scenes like the Carl Frey circus, for example, him training some zebras, or the Chaim Gross acrobats, these are again scenes, they're sort of behind the scenes of circus life, but again I think that they stretch the category of genre, which is something that we were trying to do, to stretch these categories in their traditional definitions. The Bowery painting is an interesting subject and one that Marsh just returned to again and again and again. The Bowery was an area in New York that up until about the 1860s was probably one of the most affluent areas in New York, and around about 1860s it turned into a pretty rough area. Brothels and pawn shops and sort of the denizens of New York habituated that area. That is exactly what drew Reginald Marsh to the scene. He was part of the American regionalist school and liked to paint sort of the underbelly of New York. And as a result of the Bowery being a source and place for denizens to hang out, Marsh spent a lot of time there. The painting by Conrad Seekatz is another new addition to the genre section. That's another one of my favorite pictures. It's just this intimate little picture, but if you really get up close to it, you can see his skill, his consummate skill in rendering animals and just the texture of the furs and the fabrics that these people are wearing. The painting is of a group of huntsmen after the hunt. They're resting after the hunt. And we don't know a lot about Seekatz. He was trained by his brother, and he did paint for Ludwig VIII. So at one point he was a court painter. It is wonderful early example by this artist, and once again I think it presents another group of people performing an everyday activity, resting after the hunt, within this section of the gallery. The still life section was probably the most fun to install. It's the smallest section of the gallery, so we really had to be careful about what we were picking because I really wanted to make a bold statement. And so the idea was to retain the very traditionalist still life in the center, which is what one expects when they look for a still life, of fruits and vegetables and flowers. And this hierarchy, this type of painting originated in 17th century Dutch and Holland, and Severin Rossen continues that tradition in depicting a very traditional still life. We flanked it, however, with something completely modern on both sides, the Liechtenstein and the Claes Oldenburg. The Liechtenstein is a modern uptake on the still life category. We have things that are very much part of consumer culture. We have a plastic tumbler glass that's sweating, a crustless sandwich on a little plate. I mean, he's completely updating the genre. And the other thing that he's doing that I think is quite interesting is that he limits his palette to red, white, and blue. So in a way, he's making a statement that says this is a particularly American still life. So I thought that was a great juxtaposition next to the Severin Rossen. The inclusion of the Oldenburg is probably one of the most jarring juxtapositions because people don't necessarily think of a button as a still life. But again, it is an object of everyday life. People use buttons. They lose buttons on coats and shirts all the time and are sewing them on. But Oldenburg had sort of a deeper connection to the button with the commission that he received from the University of Pennsylvania. The button is actually cited in front of the library, and the idea behind choosing a button was that, according to Oldenburg, the 4 holes in the button are recalling Philadelphia founder William Penn's design for laying out the center of the city around 4 symmetrically placed parks. So in actuality, it's not just a random fun object. He really did have some thought behind choosing the button.